The human brain is extraordinary. I've always been fascinated by the fact that forensic science, such as DNA, was collected long before we even knew what to do with it. Just knowing that science would one day advance enough that maybe we could find answers in pieces of tragedy so many years later. And my, how far we've come. Thanks to our advances in forensic science and DNA, we were able to capture the Golden State Killer after decades based on DNA evidence investigators were able to connect via his family members. Through DNA via family members, even Brian Koberger was arrested for the recent Idaho murders. While some might find this tactic questionable, I personally am all for it. It has helped so many cases, and along with that, so many families have received answers that they otherwise wouldn't have if not for this advance in forensic science. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Jaylena, and I'm so grateful to have you here where we talk about all things true crime, conspiracy, mysteries, and more. If you're new here, my boyfriend and I are converting a school bus into a tiny home on wheels for the two of us and our daughter so that we can travel the US. While on the road, I will be bringing you cases from the places that we visit. If you would like to follow along my personal journey, feel free to check out my main channel, Leave Her Wild. That being said, let's jump into today's case. This is the story of the Green River Killer. It took over 2 decades, but we finally were able to catch this serial killer thanks to DNA. The Green River Killer, aka Gary Ridgway. As far as we know, Gary began committing his crimes back in the 1980s, well before DNA was even a thing. And even though he did his very best to cover up his tracks, something that was not on his mind because it wasn't a thing at the time was DNA. And this would ultimately be his downfall. In July of 1982, a young girl named Wendy went missing. At the time, she was in foster care at the age of 16, and it wasn't a secret that Wendy had begun selling herself on the street, particularly on the street called Pacific Highway South. She left home one day and she didn't come back. A week after she went missing, a couple of young boys who were riding their bikes saw what they thought was a mannequin in the Green River. But it was most definitely not a mannequin. As the boys got closer to it, they realized that it was actually the body of a naked girl with her clothes tied around her neck. When police arrived at the scene, they assumed at first that this murder was a one-off. Something more like a domestic dispute that had led to this, or maybe a crime of passion. Wendy was a young woman in foster care working the streets. They would have no way of knowing that this would only be the beginning of an absolute nightmare for the Seattle area. A serial killer was among them, and he was only just getting started. Only a short 4 weeks after Wendy's body was found, another woman's body was found. She was floating face down in the Green River. This was 23-year-old Deborah. And only just 3 days after Deborah was found, someone would spot what looked like 2 more mannequins in the river. And by now we know that they were not mannequins. The bodies found were 17-year-old Cynthia and 31-year-old Marcia. But this time the bodies weren't just floating, they were found submerged underwater, held down by some large rocks. While they were investigating and processing this crime scene, they found the body of another woman. A third body was 16-year-old Opal. Bodies would continue to be found in the Green River. Women and young girls consistently continued to go missing. Police knew now at this point that they had a huge problem. There was an active serial killer and they had no idea who it could be. Doing their absolute best, following every lead and tip, but they just kept coming up empty. Finally, a break in the case. An 18-year-old girl named Marie goes missing in April of 1983. This would make her the 23rd girl to go missing in relation to the Green River Killer. While investigating, a witness would tell police that they saw Marie getting inside of a pickup truck the night that she was last seen. Although this wasn't new information to the police, the missing women had already been linked to a pickup truck. But this time, after the witness told the police about the pickup truck, she actually saw the very same truck in someone's driveway. Of course, police follow up on this and they find that this home belonged to a man named Gary Ridgway. Police go to his home and they speak with Gary, and although he's on their radar, to the police, Gary seems like a totally normal guy. They don't think that there's any good reason to think that he might be the killer. Maybe if they looked into Gary a little further, they would find out that Gary had a very troubled childhood. Gary was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the middle child of 3 boys. While he was still young, his family up and moved to the state of Washington. His parents bought a home close to Pacific Highway South, a street well known for sex work. Gary would eventually grow up to stalk and abduct his victims from this very street. Could growing up around such an environment play a part in the monster that Gary would become? I personally think that very well could have played a role. But there's so much more to Gary's childhood that definitely, I think, played a much bigger role in who he would eventually become. His home life was very dysfunctional, to say the least, and like I said, I think that plays a much bigger role in who he does eventually become, but I do think that that environment didn't help in the slightest. His mother was physically and verbally abusive to their entire family, even going as far as smashing a plate over her husband's head at the dinner table, and Gary's father was very dismissive. When incidents like this happened, he would just kind of shut down and he would walk away. He wouldn't defend himself in any way whatsoever. And she was extremely mean to Gary and his brothers, and she would scream at them constantly, sometimes even in front of their friends, which to them was embarrassing. Gary also had an issue with wetting the bed, and this would go on until he was 13 years old, and his mother would even make fun of him for that in front of his brothers. And when this would happen, she would force Gary to take a cold bath and scrub his, quote, dirtiest parts, aka his genitals, while she was in basically just her underwear. And this was happening even at the age of 13. She was doing this to him while he was going through puberty. Some psychiatrists have attributed this behavior between his parents to his hatred toward women. Deep down, Gary hated his mother. He hated how she treated them, all of them, his father, his brothers, himself. He also hated that his father was too weak to stand up for himself against his mother and too weak to protect him and his brothers from their mom. Gary's mom worked at a clothing store, and she would often tell Gary stories from work. So she would talk to him and she would tell him about how she would be down on her knees, measuring the inseams of these men, and she would explain to him that they would become aroused, and she would even go as far as to explain to him what their erections were like and even what that area smelled like. Absolutely disgusting and inappropriate. Obviously, this is going to play a huge part in how he would come to think about his own mom and just women in general. He was very confused, and that is very understandable. This would lead Gary to have weird fantasies about his mom. He says that the first was actually sexual. His mom would come home from work sometimes and she would lay out in the backyard in a bikini, and sometimes she would even go topless. He says that she was the only female figure that he had ever even seen. So while he's going through puberty, he is seeing his own mother like this, and he's getting very confused, which had a lot to do with the fact that she was bathing to him and speaking to him the way that she was. So looking at her, he would get aroused, and he did say that he liked the sexual aspect of his mom, but that he hated the actual mom part of his mom. But at the very same time, Gary says he had other fantasies about his mom, much darker fantasies. He says that he imagined torturing her, mutilating her, even cutting her throat, and even burning their house down with his mother inside. Gary's relationship with his mother was very toxic and obviously very inappropriate. And in my personal opinion, again, I think this definitely plays a role in what he would eventually become and how he would eventually begin to think about women and what he believed was right and wrong when it came to women. Gary would go on to say that he knew the thoughts that he was having were wrong, that they were not okay, but he couldn't stop them. All these thoughts and feelings were happening during such a developmental time in his youth. Growing up, people have said that Gary expressed to them that he wanted to be everything that his father wasn't. His father worked in a mortuary, and he would come home and he would tell Gary stories about how his coworker would have sex with the dead bodies. Yes, his father would tell his son about his coworker doing a horrific act, let alone knew that something like that was happening and he didn't do anything about it. So his dad obviously had some issues. His mom obviously had some issues. Not a great combination for a child. Personally, if this is true, I kind of feel like maybe that this is something his father was actually doing and he wanted to share that with somebody, but he didn't want to actually confess to those actions. That's just my personal opinion. That is not fact. I just feel like it's a little weird that he would say his coworker was doing it but not do anything about it. It could be possible, but I feel like maybe his dad was the one who was doing these things and he wanted to tell someone while also not admitting to those actions himself. And so again, someone in his life, his parent, is telling him about these horrific acts, and both parents are normalizing these things that are not normal whatsoever. Not okay, very, very bad. And again, this is during the most developmental time of his life. This would follow Gary later on after he starts killing. He was known to go and revisit the bodies of his victims multiple times and even using their bodies until they were so decomposed that they just became infested and covered in maggots. Even with all of the dysfunction and the abuse going on with Gary at home with his parents, he showed really not a whole lot of signs for concern. Gary's classmates would go on to say that he was fun, he was outgoing, and he was well liked at school. He was totally normal, likable. He was able to be totally normal and likable when he needed to be. But what everyone wasn't seeing was Gary was abusing animals and he was setting fires. And when he was in elementary school, if he liked a girl, he would often stalk her and follow her home. And this continued into middle school. And going into high school, he even attempted to force himself on a girl that he gave a ride home to. He was unsuccessful. And when Gary was 16, he lured a young boy into the woods and he stabbed him. Confused, the young boy asked him why, and Gary just said he just wanted to know what it was like. And this would have been a huge red flag, right? But no one knew about this incident because even though that boy survived and he did report the incident to the police, for whatever reason, the police couldn't link that back to Gary. Maybe this boy didn't necessarily even know Gary and it may have been like a random thing. So they were never able to connect the two. So he's living a totally normal life. But Gary has a pretty low IQ and he actually wound up having to repeat a couple of grades, and he didn't even graduate until he was 20 years old. After he graduated, Gary enlisted in the Navy. And it was around this time that he started dating his first girlfriend named Claudia. She was a local girl and she was only about a year younger than he was, and only after about a year of dating, they got married. Right after they got married, Gary was shipped off in the Navy, and while he was out with the Navy, he would often frequent sex workers, and he said he had to do this because his wife was just so far away. And once while he was in the Philippines, he actually contracted gonorrhea during one of these encounters, and he was very, very furious. He blamed this woman for all of his issues and all of his problems. And this was a very pivotal point in Gary's hate for women. This is kind of where his hatred for women went from just women in general to being geared toward sex workers. So when Gary returns home from the Navy, he finds out that his wife had been cheating on him also. And this left Gary furious. To him, she was no longer his wife. She was now a orhue. I don't know if you can say that on YouTube, or if that's even the correct terminology in Pig Latin, but I think you get the point. She was very much lesser to him now. So he divorces her. As if he wasn't also cheating on his wife the entire time that he was away at the Navy. So Gary finds himself back in Washington State in 1972, and he gets a job painting designs on trucks, and his coworkers and his neighbors from this time all say that he was just a normal guy. Very average, super nice guy who seemed a bit odd at times, but in general was just, the average Joe. No one suspected anything out of the ordinary. And he even winds up getting married again. Unlike his first marriage, he spends much more time with his second wife. Being away in the Navy when he was married to his first wife didn't really give her a chance to see or experience any of Gary's red flags or warning signs like his second wife did. Gary would often take his second wife out to the Green River to have sex with her. He had a fetish for having sex outdoors. He would actually later use these same places to dump his future victims' bodies. And this is also where he would return to those bodies. Over time, these encounters with his wife would become more frequent and more violent. He needed this. But his wife would eventually become pregnant with Gary's first child, their son. Gary was not happy about the pregnancy, and after she had the baby, there was a period of time that she couldn't have sex, and this was a problem for Gary. At this point, his wife was useless to him, and it was his son's fault. His son was taking attention and time away from Gary because their son needed his mother, and to her, their son was more important than Gary's sexual needs. Go figure. After the baby was born and then they were able to start having sex again, Gary started to get a little weird and do some weird things. He would often try and scare her to arouse himself, and he even began to start choking her until she was on the verge of passing out. And at this point, his wife had had enough. She was out. She couldn't do it anymore, and she wound up getting a divorce from Gary. This made Gary very angry, and this would go on to just contribute even further his hatred towards women. Gary actually even goes on to say that if he had only killed his second wife, he would not have killed all those other women. Those other women were just basically stand-ins for his second wife. It was after this second divorce that Gary at some point began killing. Now remember, Gary has a son, and he got to have his son every other weekend. So he would actually use his son as a way to earn trust of these women. He would get these women inside of his car, and they would ask him for his ID. And so he would show them, and he would cover up his name, but he would show them his ID with his photo, but purposely he had photos of his son on the opposite side of his wallet that they could see. And he would even leave some of his son's stuff and some of his toys in the back seat of the car to give the impression of a family setting. He would even go as far as to take them back to his house and show them his son's room, and once even let his son meet one of these women. Gary says that these women even asked him over 50 times if he was the Green River Killer. I'm telling you, ladies, trust your intuition, because most of the time you are correct. So by the end of 1983, there were over 13 victims found, all being either sex workers or runaways. By 1984, the local authorities finally developed a Green River Killer task force. But these victims in particular were all basically trying to avoid the police in the first place. So they were not necessarily on anyone's radar, leaving them to be like the perfect victims. So among his first victims, he would go on to leave only 5 out of 10 by the Green River. He would eventually branch out, leaving his victims in other places. Gary goes on to say that he liked leaving his victims together and in clusters so that he could go back to those places and drive by those places and relive those memories. And when he would revisit these places and his victims, he would just do horrific things to their bodies. But by him doing this, the police were able to connect DNA from some of his victims that he would revisit, though there was nothing that they could do with this DNA at the time. By the end of 1984, he had killed over 40 women when all of a sudden the task force noted a dramatic drop in the number of victims. This was around the time that he would get married to his third wife. Some think that the drop in the number of victims has to do with the fact that he was married again and his sexual needs were being met now by his new wife. But also at the time, the task force wound up getting really close to Gary, and they even had him take a polygraph test, which he passed, leaving them with nothing to hold him on, so they did have to let him go and move on. So some think that this might have frightened him, and so he was just being cautious at the time. And for whatever reason, the task force actually winds up making their way back to Gary and realizes that he doesn't have an alibi for any of the disappearances for any of the missing or murdered women. And when they began diving deeper into Gary, they started looking at his receipts and started tracking his gas station stops and realized that he was spending a lot more money on gas than someone who claims to only really go back and forth to work and doesn't really go anywhere else. So at this point, they actually wind up putting Gary into a picture lineup, and a couple of witnesses were actually able to identify Gary as someone who was with some of the missing and murdered women. So because of everything that they had on Gary up to this point, they were able to get a search warrant for his house. But they found nothing, because even though Gary had a pretty low IQ and he wasn't very smart, he was smart enough to not keep any trophies at his house. What I find really interesting is that he did actually take trophies, which was usually jewelry from his victims, but so odd. He would take these trophies to work with him, and he would actually hide them in the women's bathroom in hopes that someone would find these, and then he would wait. He would watch and he would wait, hoping to see one of his coworkers wearing the jewelry. This is how he was able to kind of get away with having trophies, but he also really got off on this. So he was pretty tactical and smart when it came to covering his tracks, and I mean literally. If he noticed that he would leave tire tracks somewhere, he would immediately go out and get his tires changed. If a victim even scratched him, he would cut their fingers off. And he would even meet with other sex workers and just have normal encounters with them so that they would go on to be able to vouch for him and say that he was normal, say that no one has any reason to be scared, he was totally fine with me, like, you're gonna be okay. Which is so crazy to think that, like, he went that far. He even, like, planted evidence. So he would leave cigarettes in places even though he wasn't a smoker. And at one point he started leaving airplane pamphlets to try and convince the police that the killer traveled. Even going so far as to drive some of the victims' remains from Seattle to Portland to throw off the police, which they actually investigated that lead a little bit. And so it seemed like he was kind of always one step ahead. But in the summer of 2001, police were able to match Gary's DNA with DNA that they had from evidence from old crime scenes. So then they picked Gary up outside of his work. His DNA was linked to 4 of his victims. And of course, he was able to make a deal. In exchange for them taking the death penalty off of the table, Gary would confess everything. He kept his word, and he led police to the bodies of victims that had not been found yet. And police were able to link him to the murders of 49 women. although they suspected that he was connected to 71. And he even goes on to say that he thinks that he's killed over 90 women. Gary says that he has difficulty remembering all of his victims. He even says that he doesn't even remember his first kill, which is surprising to me. I feel like that's a huge, monumental moment in a killer's life. He claims that at that time when he was 16 and he stabbed that boy in the woods, that he also drowned another boy in a lake. And 2 boys actually did drown in that very same lake that Gary was talking about at that time, but police had no evidence to link Gary to either one of those deaths. So this could actually be his first killing if he's telling the truth, but we just don't know. Something else that stands out to me that I find curious is that he stabs that boy and he claims to have drowned a boy, but all of his victims later on are women. Just food for thought. Gary is now serving a life sentence at a Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, a prison that houses some of America's worst serial killers. A little more food for thought, there are so many serial killers that come out of the state of Washington. It's kind of scary to think about. What is it about Washington that births so many sick individuals? And don't come at me if you're from Washington, because I am also from Washington. I was born in Spokane, and I have tons of family in Washington. And now I question every single one of them. I'm just kidding. But it really does make me think. The Pacific Northwest in general produces a lot of killers, and it's really eerie to think about. It's almost like a Bermuda Triangle for serial killers, or killers in general. Like, if you're born in the PNW, you might be a killer. But alas, that concludes today's story, the Green River Killer case. And as always, I want to hear your thoughts on this case. So please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And I just want to thank you guys all so much for watching, and I'm sending you all of the love. So until next time.